My sister's kid just threw my purse into the pool and screamed, "Dad says you don't get it." I froze, clutching the wet leather, heart pounding. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Alara, I'm 28, and I've always prided myself on being independent, working hard, and carving out my own life here in Denver. Today, though, I felt all of that effort collapse in an instant. My sister, Lena, has always had this quiet way of making everything about her, but seeing her 8-year-old daughter, Mara, throw my purse into the pool and repeat her words, it stung deeper than anything I expected. The day started like any other family gathering at my parents' house. The sun glinted off the water, kids laughed, and the smell of barbecue floated through the backyard. Everyone seemed normal, smiling, chatting, but there was an edge in Lena's gaze, a subtle smirk that told me she had something planned. Mara's grin as she clutched the soaked leather purse confirmed it. I could feel the tension rippling under the surface, the invisible line Lena had drawn, daring me to react. I stood there, dripping wet, my heart racing, trying to process the audacity of it all. I wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, but something told me this wasn't just about a purse, it was about years of small, calculated slights that had been building quietly. And I knew, deep down, that how I handled this moment would define everything that came next. As I wrung out my soaked sleeves, a cold realization hit me, this wasn't just an isolated act of mischief. Lena had been planting seeds of doubt about me for years, twisting every story, every mistake, until even Dad seemed to question my judgment. Memories surged unbidden. Last Christmas, when I suggested helping with the decorations, Dad had brushed me off, insisting Lena knew best. At my promotion celebration last year, he barely acknowledged my achievement, while praising Lena's minor project as though it were groundbreaking. Every family decision, every shared opinion, seemed tilted in her favor. The betrayal cut deeper than Mara's childish prank. It wasn't just about a purse in a pool, it was about realizing my own family had quietly sided with Lena, letting her manipulations shape their view of me. The anger bubbled beneath the surface, mingled with disbelief. How had I been so blind for so long? The person I thought I could trust without question, the father I admired, had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, been swayed by my sister's quiet schemes. I felt like an outsider in the very home I grew up in, and the sting of that betrayal left a weight in my chest I couldn't shake. I yanked my arm free from Mara's sticky little hands and stormed toward the garden gate, dragging the soaked purse behind me like a weight. The laughter from the pool felt like nails scraping against my nerves, and every cheerful voice around me grated harder with each step. My mind spun in a cyclone of disbelief. How could Dad let this happen? How could he nod along while Lena trained her own daughter to humiliate me in front of everyone? Anger surged, hot and sharp, mixing with the sting of humiliation. I had trusted them to see me as more than just the convenient scapegoat, the other sister. With every step away from the pool, my pulse pounded in my ears, and I could feel the injustice settling deep into my chest. It wasn't just about the ruined purse anymore, it was about every slight, every dismissive glance, every time my worth had been quietly erased. I clenched my jaw, the ache in my gut a reminder that this family, my own blood, had somehow become an opponent rather than an ally. Sitting alone on the back porch, I replayed every moment where Lena had stepped over me, carefully erasing my achievements. She had taken credit for my ideas at work, whispered doubts about my reliability to mutual friends, and even manipulated family finances to make me look careless. Each memory stung, sharper now, fueling a resolve I hadn't felt before. I realized I couldn't confront her recklessly, she thrived on drama and would twist it to her advantage. Instead, I needed a plan that would strike where it hurt most, her carefully constructed image of control and superiority. I began mapping small, deliberate moves in my head, each one designed to expose her without overt aggression. Patience would be my ally. Every interaction, every family gathering, could become a tool. I would wait for the right moment, the perfect combination of truth and timing, so that Lena couldn't deny the impact. The idea of quietly watching her unravel while I remained composed made a strange, satisfying weight settle in my chest. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let it slip. I started by quietly doubling down on my work, taking on projects Lena had dismissed as unimportant and transforming them into successes that couldn't be ignored. Each completed task, each compliment from colleagues, felt like a small reclaiming of ground she had tried to claim as her own. Outside the office, I reached out to friends who had been caught in Lena's web of subtle lies. I listened, empathized, and slowly rebuilt trust, showing them the truth without overt confrontation. Their acknowledgement, the way they began to see me clearly again, was like a balm to old wounds. With every passing week, I felt the balance shift. Lena's influence began to waver in subtle ways, offhand remarks were met with polite but firm corrections, and friends who had once taken her side now looked to me for guidance. The satisfaction was quiet but powerful. I realized that even small, measured victories could carry the weight of triumph, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was regaining the life that had been quietly undermined. I began leaving small, almost casual remarks around Dad, pointing out inconsistencies in stories Lena had told, highlighting moments where her judgment had been questionable, all without ever directly accusing her. Each comment was carefully measured, designed to make him pause and think rather than react. Meanwhile, Lena started to sense a shift. Her confident smirks faded in family conversations, replaced by quick glances and tense pauses. I noticed how she hesitated before speaking, replaying interactions in her mind, trying to predict my next move. I stayed composed, outwardly unaffected, letting her doubt grow unchecked. Watching her tighten with every subtle challenge, every questioning look from Dad, gave me a quiet satisfaction. The power dynamics were beginning to tilt, and for the first time, Lena seemed uncertain in a way that left her exposed, vulnerable to the very scrutiny she had used against me for years. It was during a weekend brunch at Mom and Dad's that Mara, with wide-eyed innocence, repeated something Lena had whispered to her earlier, a thinly veiled dig meant to make me look unreasonable. My chest tightened, but this time I didn't flinch. I let her words hang in the air for a heartbeat, then responded calmly, weaving together the truth of past events with the context Mara had unwittingly revealed. Slowly, the pieces aligned before everyone's eyes. Subtle manipulations Lena had counted on staying hidden were suddenly undeniable. The room went quiet. Lena's confident posture faltered, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for a script she hadn't prepared. Dad's eyes narrowed, the first flicker of doubt crossing his face, and I realized the careful threads of deceit Lena had spun for years were unraveling. The moment was electric, a turning point where long-buried truths finally demanded attention. Later that evening, I asked Lena to step into the quiet study. The air between us was thick, tension crackling like static. She bristled immediately, eyes flashing, ready to accuse before I spoke a word. I remained steady, letting her storm through her anger while I listened, calm and measured. Once she had vented enough to exhaust the initial fury, I began laying out the moments she had undermined me, taking credit for my efforts at work, twisting stories to turn friends and family against me, even meddling in personal matters to make me appear careless. I spoke clearly, without shouting, letting the weight of each betrayal settle in the room. Her defenses faltered, and for the first time I saw genuine unease. She tried to justify her actions, but my composure contrasted sharply with her flailing explanations. In that room, the audience could feel the depth of the wounds she had caused, and though her anger remained, it was impossible not to recognize the fairness in my reckoning. The balance had shifted. For once, the victim's voice was the one being heard. The next morning, I found Dad in his study, nursing a cup of coffee. I approached slowly, choosing my words with care. Calm but resolute, I asked him to consider how Lena's actions had affected me over the years, pointing out the patterns of favoritism and the subtle ways my opinions had been dismissed. He stiffened at first, then sank into the chair, face pale. I could see the weight of recognition settling in, how he had overlooked my efforts, how he had allowed Lena's influence to cloud his judgment. The guilt was raw, etched across his features, as he realized the trust he had broken and the distance he had unintentionally created between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy but cleansing, a tension that had been building for decades finally beginning to release. I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief as I watched him wrestle with the truth, knowing that acknowledgement, even belated, was the first step toward healing. Over the following weeks, I watched Lena stumble through family interactions with increasing awkwardness. Casual remarks I made, stories I shared, and the truth revealed in subtle ways began to chip away at the trust she had long relied on. Friends and relatives started noticing inconsistencies in her words, questioning things they had once accepted without hesitation. She floundered, trying to maintain her composed facade, but the doubt surrounding her grew quietly yet unmistakably. Invitations she expected, deference she assumed, it all began to slip through her fingers, unnoticed by anyone but her. I never gloated or celebrated openly. Instead, I focused on living steadily, letting the clarity of my actions and the undeniable truth speak for themselves. Watching Lena's careful world crumble under the weight of honesty, without me lifting a finger aggressively, was satisfaction enough. In that silence, dignity reclaimed its place, and I finally felt the quiet, lasting triumph that had eluded me for so long. With Lena's influence fading, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I carved out time for the things I had neglected for years, long walks through the quiet streets of Denver, evenings curled up with books I'd put aside, and small adventures that reminded me who I was outside of family expectations. I reached out to friends I hadn't spoken to in months, rekindling bonds that had been strained by past manipulation. We laughed over shared memories, and their support reinforced the sense of stability I had been missing. At work, I threw myself into projects with renewed energy, no longer competing silently with anyone but my own ambitions. Each step of this rebuilding felt deliberate, a reclaiming of my identity piece by piece. The tension that had shadowed me for years began to lift, replaced by a quiet confidence and independence. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully anchored in my own life, guided by my own choices rather than the expectations or interference of others. A few weeks later, Lena sent a message asking to meet, her words heavy with an apology that felt rehearsed, lacking the sincerity I had hoped for. I read it slowly, feeling the familiar tug of old patterns, the temptation to let things slide as I once had. I met her briefly at a quiet cafe, listening as she attempted to explain herself, weaving excuses into her remorse. I nodded politely, keeping my expression neutral, aware that my boundaries were the most important thing I could assert. When she finished, I calmly told her I wasn't willing to return to the dynamics that had caused so much pain. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation, just a clear line drawn in the sand. The relief of asserting my self-respect outweighed any satisfaction her apology could offer. In that moment, I understood that the strongest victories weren't about humiliating others, they were about standing firm in your own truth and refusing to let the past dictate your future. Sitting alone on my balcony one evening, I let my thoughts drift over everything that had happened. I considered the tangled web of favoritism, manipulation, and broken trust that had shaped so much of my past. The sting of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer controlled me. I realized that forgiveness wasn't the priority, protecting myself and maintaining clear boundaries was what truly mattered. The years of compromise and silent endurance had taught me that self-respect could never be sacrificed for the sake of keeping peace. In this quiet reflection, I felt a steady growth within me, a resilience that had been forged through hardship and careful observation. I understood now that maturity wasn't about forgetting the wounds or letting them define me, but about learning how to navigate relationships with clarity, strength, and an unwavering sense of my own worth. One afternoon, Mara approached me with that same mischievous glint in her eyes, clearly hoping to provoke a reaction. She made a teasing comment about my choices, probably expecting me to flare up like I once would have. I took a slow breath, smiled gently, and responded with calm authority, redirecting the conversation without judgment or anger. Her surprise was evident, and the moment passed without incident. I could see that the pattern she had learned from Lena no longer held any power over me. Watching her scurry off, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. I realized then that the culmination of all my patience, resilience, and careful strategy had led to this, a space where truth and composure held more weight than any outburst. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't anger, it's letting the truth speak for itself.